We would like to begin by acknowledging that we are in Mi'kmaq, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. We are honored to work and serve on this land. Reachability stands with the protesters across Canada, the United States, and across the globe, demanding an end to police brutality and racism. We acknowledge the deep and powerful challenges faced by the Black community in Nova Scotia, Canada, and beyond. Welcome, everybody. My name is Tova Sherman, and I'm going to be guiding you today through an introduction to the accessible tourist. To be clear, today is Thursday, June 4th. We are in the middle of National Accessibility Week, and this special presentation is dedicated to inclusion, the Accessible Canada Act, or as we like to call it, the ACA, and the tourism industry in particular, a very hard-hit industry in our present condition and situation. I want to let you know before we begin that there will be a Q&A afterward. This module will run around an hour, just a little over. And our hope is then to be able to open up to questions, whether you're visiting us from YouTube or right here on Big Marker, where you've already registered for National Accessibility Week. If you want more information about anything that we are talking about today, feel free to reach out to me personally at Tova, T-O-V-A, at reachability.org. I may not be able to help you, but I will make sure somebody does. So hopefully that's going to help us get through today as well. So hold those questions. I've specifically designed the slides today to carry a little more information that I might do in a traditional live dynamic. As a result, I'm actually going to black myself out and let you focus on the slides rather than distracted by either AKA my beautiful face, my incredible message, or perhaps anything else that's annoying like my yellow walls. So with that, I do ask you to understand that part of the reason I'm doing that is also I want to support both auditory and visual learners in being able to focus on that which is most important. As a person who is on the ADHD spectrum, it's also important to me to have a clear screen in which to look. So I'm very sensitive to those issues as well. With that, I'm going to invite the slide to begin and exit until further notice. I'm working on turning my camera off. Wow, that's a good invitation. This way to inclusion for the tourism industry. So let's look. Today, we're going to be talking about inclusive travel, truly what I believe not to be a best frontier, but a next frontier. But first, let me give you some background. I myself grew up in a family where every single member of my family actually lived with a disability. So to me, disability was not strange or unusual or mythic in proportion, but rather just something everybody seemed to have. So that truly informed me and how I saw things in my life and how I saw disability and why I think I became so interested in learning more and becoming an expert in the field. Growing up, we traveled a lot. I can remember from my very first trip, it wasn't a car trip. We got on a plane and flew to visit some cousins. We were so excited. And I even remember the plane ran out of Coca-Cola because my siblings and I basically cleaned them out. We couldn't believe there was free pop. 20 years later, well, Reachability is here to say that we as a team not only lead in the field of disability, but we also come to you today as a first-person voice, people who live with disability. One of the most important things we'll be touching on today around the ACA is the message, not for us, without us. And that's certainly the message Reachability has continued to send, especially in its action, not just its words. Our team, the majority do self-identify as living with disability. And I think that it's not an exclusive club, but truly an inclusive one. I myself, just to be clear on the professional side, am the founder of the Blue Nose Ability Arts and Film Festival, a truly premier arts disability community event, that is 1 week a year. But really what it's all about is creating and providing a voice to the disability arts community across Canada, but especially here in Nova Scotia. We are also pleased as Reachability to be the hosts of National Accessibility Week Nova Scotia, which has never been more relevant than this year of the passing of the ACA, or Accessible Canada Act. And I'm also proud to be, for the 20th year, the CEO of Reachability, someone who reports to a fine group of board members who are truly people who care about our community, our team, our clients, you name it. This is all about providing a voice, because not for us, without us. And as a person who, as I mentioned, lives on the ADHD spectrum, I also come to you as a first-person voice. So today, the tourism edition is presented by the Accessible Tourist. The Accessible Tourist was designed with a very clear message in mind, and I'm going to get to that in a moment. But first, I just wanted to say on behalf of all the stakeholders around disability and inclusion across Canada, I really do want to welcome you to this presentation. This tourism edition has been presented by the Accessible Tourist. As host of today's session, which is all dedicated to the inclusion of persons with all types of disabilities, whether tourists or stakeholders in this crucial industry, I really did want to take a second and just say welcome. The fact is, we know things have changed, especially in this, what I call PC or post-COVID world. And this is why more than ever, the tourism industry in our province and beyond must engage Canada's single largest population of persons with disabilities per capita, and that's those living right here in Nova Scotia. Meaning, Nova Scotia has the largest per capita population saying, yes, I do live with a disability, than any other province. But I'll be very frank with all of you. It is my belief that we will all have, or will have a disability. And we'll be talking a bit more about the problems with stigma in a moment. Again, Reachability has been, as I mentioned, serving the community, for 20 years. And our goal has always been the same, to equalize the playing field, one ability at a time. There's nothing special about that. We understand we can't do everything at Reachability, but we never, ever let that get in the way of what we can do. We are a team of dedicated, award-winning facilitators, influencers, legal, medical, and educational professionals who've all come together to develop a module that is good, welcoming, honest, fair, and inclusive. So let's see how we do. Our focus at Reachability has always been many services to the few, rather than few services to the many. And let me explain what that means. We call it the Reachability Method, but it's really quite straightforward. Rather than having 10,000 people on a roster and giving everybody a crumb, we made a decision to max out at this stage to 500 clients a year, and to work with those clients in any way possible, whether that's in self-management, culture and recreation, mental health and wellness, individual advocacy, or employment services. Everything we offer is 100% free for participants. And in this PC or post-COVID world, all our programs are now available online. And if you aren't online, or someone you know, because you're here today, but if someone you know can't access us online, don't you worry. We've got plenty of clients saying that, and you can simply reach out at 902-429-5878. And of course, we'll provide that information later. Let's continue. I want to make sure that industry stakeholders in the tourism industry understand a couple of things in terms of knowing we get this. In today's new reality, the truth is every sector has to expand inclusion to literally include every citizen. In addition, the industry is being held accountable to be compliant with all the latest legislation, whether that's the ACA, the Accessible Canada Act, or the various provincial acts in Ontario, Manitoba, and right here in Nova Scotia. The question I want to answer for you is, can inclusion of persons with disabilities in the industry as both employees and clients or customers, can it truly be a win-win-win? Well, the Accessible Tourist is here to say yes. Everyone can win if we simply follow the simple path that has been led, or I should say built and opened by the Accessible Tourist program, a program dedicated, to be clear, literally dedicated to the message of telling them what you did, not how you did it. Let me be clear. For persons living with disabilities, the story often isn't how good the concert was, but how I actually got in there, got to a place where I could see just like anybody else. Or how maybe I didn't get in a fight because of all the yelling and screaming and they had no quiet space. Or maybe something else happened. We, as persons with disabilities, often have to say how we did things rather than what we did. And the Accessible Tourist wants you to walk down the street and see this bus ad in your town. So how was your trip? The ad asks. It was awesome. I went ziplining, climbed a waterfall, floated in the ocean, went horseback riding, and jumped out of a plane. We want you to tell them what you did, not how you did it. And that's the commitment of the Accessible Tourist program. So let's be clear. It is time to see the value, and it is time to understand the market within the accessible tourism industry in this country. After all, let's be real. Your customer base is growing in maybe different ways than perhaps you've ever imagined. And your choices in terms of talent pool need to grow exponentially, because when you consider hiring inclusively, you are also expanding the diversity of your team. You are creating a healthier culture. But here's the reality, and I say it all the time. Even if we remove all the architectural barriers in the tourism industry, no matter what, no matter how many sliding doors, no matter how many buttons, without the education, we cannot remove the attitudinal barriers that still remain. And that's why the Accessible Tourist was developed, because we believe that Canadians in the tourism industry need to implement the very win-win-win strategy that we can show and prove leaves no one behind. I want to again acknowledge this industry has taken an incredible hit, one that will take, not may take, will take years to recover from. All the more reason this is not the time to pull back. It is the time to engage as many Canadians as possible, as soon as possible. So I think that's a compelling argument to discuss inclusion. I think it's a compelling argument in terms of what the Accessible Tourist is focused on. But let's really get down to basics, because I do want to provide you some information today that you can use right now. So when I say the basics, I mean, let's cover some key definitions as they relate to the conversation we're going to have today around disability inclusion. I often say it's like the Tower of Babel, the biblical place where people would go and all speak different languages and no one knew what they meant. it's extremely important to me that words like disability, inclusion, accommodation, universal design, that we talk about those words so we're all on the same page as we discuss how to be the best in your business. We also want to replace some of those long-held myths because actual facts are much more important, compelling, and of course, we don't want to make you sift through to find these facts when they're right in front of us as inclusion experts trying to share with you all of the wins you can achieve by really addressing your approach to inclusion. We're also going to share with you the relevant legislation that is emerging both here in Nova Scotia and beyond in Canada, especially around the ACA. And we're going to have a very special guest join us to discuss the ACA all the way from Ottawa. We're also going to provide you some really specific hospitality-related tips because I want to provide you some things to throw in that toolkit. But there's a lot more to come. The Accessible Tourist and today's module is dedicated to solutions, solutions, solutions. I often say to my staff, if you're gonna bitch, you gotta pitch. Or as I like to say it, pitch, don't bitch. But truthfully, it is that commitment to solutions that has brought reachability to this place today and to bring to you the Accessible Tourist. So let's get started. I wanted to talk about some definitions and terminology. So first of all, disability. Look, disability is any condition that makes it more difficult for a person to do certain activities or interact with the world around them. These conditions or impairments may be cognitive, developmental, intellectual, mental, physical, sensory, or a combination of multiple factors. So that's always interesting, but rather than just grabbing something from a dictionary or a medical journal, I really wanted to provide, as always, a voice to persons with disabilities right in the province, Nova Scotia here, and what they think accessibility means to them. So I'm really excited about this consultation that the Accessibility Directorate did right here in Nova Scotia. And the results of that consultation really inform what persons with disabilities think accessibility means. So let's review that right now. These consultation participants described their accessible Nova Scotia as being one, inclusive and equitable, meaning persons with disabilities have access to the same resources, services, and infrastructure as any other Nova Scotians, that we are able to participate in society and lead meaningful, fulfilling lives. What else does accessibility mean to Nova Scotians who participated in this consultation? It means barrier-free. I get a lot of questions about what barrier-free means. Well, who better to ask than people who experience those barriers right here? And here's what they said. Persons with disabilities do not face barriers to buildings, sidewalks, or outdoor spaces. That may surprise you. They have equitable access to education, healthcare, employment, affordable housing, communications, and transportation. This is what barrier-free means. It means we all can enter buildings. We all can have fair access to education, healthcare, employment, and affordable housing, communication, and transportation. That there are enough services for the people who need them. That's what barrier-free means. And words like safe and respectful, those are some powerful words. Well, what it means is for people with disabilities is that we feel safe in our own community. That we don't worry every minute of every day that we face stigma or discrimination anytime you speak to someone. And in these difficult times we face right now, it is no better time than to address stigma and discrimination in all its faces in the industry and beyond. Educated and aware, well, to Nova Scotia's persons with disabilities, that means that Nova Scotians are aware of issues related to accessibility and disability, because after all, every one of us will have had, has or will have a disability in our lives. And if you don't believe that, I can promise you this: you will love someone who does and care deeply about the result. So we want to educate and create awareness for Nova Scotians around accessibility and disability inclusion. And accessibility for persons with disability in Nova Scotia also means, here's a good word, proactive, meaning we don't wait for things to happen. We proactively address accessibility, that we consider it at all stages when we develop a program or policy, whether it is the ACA or any policy or program, that accessibility must be automatically considered like any other human right. So that was pretty powerful to hear a voice from the people in the community and what those words mean to them. And there was a few more I just wanted to get in before we move on, and that was universal design. It is a term I use a lot around barrier-free because it's really describing the degree to which a system is usable, here's the key, by as many people as possible. Universal design is also a way of thinking about design, thinking about how to eliminate barriers, how to make things easier. Truthfully, universal design is the best approach to designing things that are accessible and user-friendly for the entire population. An accommodation? Well, before I even read this, I want to start right now by saying anyone who puts the word special in front of accommodation does not understand the importance of equalizing the playing field, because accommodation relates to any change in the environment that will allow a person with a disability, impairment, or barrier to participate or be engaged. That would be considered an accommodation. Nothing special about that. Accommodations may be temporary, periodic, or even long-term, depending on the condition. That's pretty straightforward. So with those definitions in mind, I ask you to move forward with me to the part of this presentation where we're going to separate what is long-held myths with a couple of facts specifically directed at the hospitality tourism industry, because again, this module, although I think universal in its messaging, certainly you could share it with anyone, I do think it does have a focus on the industry. So let's look at some facts. Nearly 1 in 4 Americans or Canadians identify as living with disability, and it is more than 1 in 3 here in Nova Scotia. And these are the ones self-identifying. I cannot tell you how many people I speak to who say it's not a disability, it's a pain in the ass. Well, actually, that's my mother who says that, but that's another story. Although I have that on tape, so you can quote me on that. In the past 2 years, the truth is 26 million Americans with varying types of disability took 73 million trips, whether for business or pleasure. And on those trips, they spent a whopping $17.3 billion for a total economic impact of $34.6 billion. In fact, according to Travel Agent Central, the accessible, or as I call it, inclusive travel market is growing at an astounding rate of 22% annually. And this really surprised me. But I guess when you think about it, as a baby boomer, I'm clearly not traveling enough, especially luxuriously, because 80% of the luxury travel market is baby boomers. And in fact, 55% of every dollar that was spent on travel was spent by baby boomers. I'm finally feeling in with the baby boomers. Now, I have to acknowledge something. You are the accessible hosts, whether a municipality, whether a hotel, a restaurant, a park, an attraction. There's so many. I want to tell you something. If you wish to become an accessible host, I promise you, the love of travel is not gone. It is only looking for a new landing pad. And I believe that's where the accessible hosts can come in. So I hope those were some good, compelling information that allowed us to talk about why be inclusive. But there's actually more. It's the law. The truth is that both provincial and federal legislation, as I mentioned, have passed. I'd like to look a little closely first at the provincial legislation here in Nova Scotia that relates to all of us, and then move to the federal legislation as well, and just explain some of that. First of all, the Accessibility Act. Nova Scotia's Accessibility Act was passed on April 27, 2017, and it was proclaimed on September 18, 2017. Nova Scotia, as I mentioned, is the third province to enact accessibility legislation. The Nova Scotia Act recognizes accessibility as a basic human right and has set a very ambitious goal of an accessible province by 2030. The Act has been based on 6 key standards. First of all, I want to tell you the standards will begin by applying to the government, followed by public sector bodies, and then other entities, including private sector, NGO, and more. The first standards developed will relate to built environment and education. And we talked a bit about what that meant a moment ago. The development of the standards in the remaining areas will begin at a projected 1 per year beginning next year. I'm especially interested in the Accessibility Advisory Board, as they will be continuing to recommend the order of things and also advise on the Act throughout this process. The 6 standards I mentioned, well, again, I just want to briefly remind you what relates, because we're going to talk also a little bit about grants and opportunities, and they will address these standards. So keep them in mind as you think about whether or not a grant might fit your business, especially here in Nova Scotia. So the first standard, as mentioned, was built environment. Now, the standards in this area for the province of Nova Scotia are going to specifically address how we make buildings, streets, sidewalks, and shared spaces accessible to all. The second, education, very important to me. We are presently having part 2 of our panel on education and inclusion of persons with disabilities at 3 o'clock today and yesterday at 3 o'clock, and it's posted on YouTube, I believe, Reachability's YouTube channel. So please check out part 1 if you're interested in education and the discussion, and part 2 again today at 3, where we're going to have Dal, the Mount. We spoke with NASCAD. We've spoken with a number of the universities, the Mounts coming in. So you're going to want to watch that if you have interest in barrier-free in learning environments for post-secondary here in Nova Scotia. But the Accessibility Act in particular wants to create barrier-free learning environments for all students in public schools, as well as private institutions like college and university. These standards could address how students with disabilities, will get instruction and learning materials the way they need it, meaning we don't tell them how they learn. We figure it out and work with them. Another very important aspect of the Accessibility Act, and one that Reachability works very hands-on with, is employment. And the Act says that employment standards must support people with disabilities in finding meaningful employment. The goal of this standard is to ensure simply equal access to employment for persons with all types of disabilities. Now, I do want to go back because I want to say something really important. There is something that we're not going to have time for today called undue hardship. And there's a lot of different already in place standards around employment. I am not suggesting that you hire the wrong person for a job. Reachability has its success based on a simple concept: right person, right job. I just don't want you excluding persons with disabilities because you're assuming their capacity. You're assuming what they can't do, or even more importantly, you're assuming what they might need. We need to provide you the information so you can make those calls from an educated standpoint. And that's what the Accessible Host is all about. Building hosts through the Accessible Tourist Network who get it and understand that this is not hard. The ease of accommodation is something I have spent 25 years talking about. And the story has changed very little other than there's more stats. So please know when I talk about employment, I mean right person, right job. The next standard is goods and services, and that refers to delivering received goods and services, including how where assistive devices may fit, how we can make sure that everyone can access different goods and services, how we obtain them, and also providing, again, that education, that core need on how to serve persons with disabilities, something Reachability has won awards for over the last 20 years and is now partnering with the Accessible Tourist Program to bring to the hospitality industry. The next standard is information and communication. And simply, we want to ensure all Nova Scotians share and receive the same information. They may consider alternative formats, accessible websites, technology and standards. So if you have a website you'd like to connect here in Nova Scotia and make more accessible, Reachability and the Accessible Tourist can help you not only connect with who does it, but even connect with how to get a grant to support maybe 2/3 of the costs related. And we'll be talking about that in a moment. Again, the final Accessibility Act standard is transportation, something that has been a challenge for Nova Scotians for an awfully long time. These standards are being developed to help make it easier for people to travel, whether rural or urban. Transportation would fall under the Federal Accessibility Act, which we're going to be talking about because air and rail travel and so on. So we will be addressing that as well when we break down a little bit around the Accessible Canada Act. So what do we know? We know the Act applies to both private and public sector organizations. We know the Act will include and does include compliance and enforcement mechanisms. As I like to call it, does it have teeth? I'm also pleased that the provincial government is investing $1 million per year for accessibility grants for businesses just like yours to become more inclusive. And in these challenging financial times, there's no better time than to apply for a cost-shared grant through the Department of Communities, Culture, and Heritage to make accessibility-related improvements. The grant itself will cover 66% of eligible expenses. The grants are limited to $100,000 per applicant per year. And if you are one of the people who only recently put some really expensive stuff in to make your business more inclusive, whether that's through your communications or any of the standards, you may be able to reach back and get that support. So don't be shy to reach out to the link I've provided you at CCH, which is Communities, Culture, and Heritage .novascotia.ca/business accessibility grant program. So check that out because you might be surprised. Great group of people. And if you need help figuring all this out, or perhaps I simply moved too fast for you, feel free to reach out to Amanda, AMANDA, at reachability.org if you have a question about the grant program and are unable to find direct information to the business accessibility grant program. Reachability is very proud to have been working with CCH these last few years on ensuring that that program gets the information on that program gets to all the right people. All right. The ACA has arrived. I think that makes National Accessibility Week all the more important this year. It is one of the reasons we chose not to delay, but push forward with an all digital, all free for all, a little bit of a free for all, but I mean at no cost, week of events. 26 events this week dedicated to National Accessibility Week and honoring the incredible accomplishments of persons with disabilities. So let's get started. Known originally as Bill C-81, the federal government passed a national accessibility law that was first introduced in Parliament in 2017. The purpose of that Bill C-81 was to ensure Canada has barrier-free areas under federal jurisdiction. It is called the Accessible Canada Act, or as you've heard me say already a million times, the ACA. To be clear, the bill proposes creating the Canadian Accessibility Standards Development Organization, and they have, which is developing model accessibility standards. Nothing about us without us. The Accessible Canada Act is being implemented in partnership with people with disabilities and from the disability community. A couple of things I wanted to feature in the Act. First of all, I really appreciate the simple vision. Proactively eliminate and prevent barriers to ensure greater opportunities for persons with all types of disabilities. I always say that because sometimes we forget that there's a lot more going on than just one type of disability. I also want you to consider that less than 60% of those aged 25 to 64 living with a disability have jobs, and that they are earning up to 50% less based on their challenges. We need to equalize the playing field. We have to consider this. And the goals of the Accessibility Act particularly interested me as well. The realization, of course, of that barrier-free Canada we keep talking about. The importance of culture change, something that we're going to be discussing, especially to the accessible hosts. Standards development, proactive compliance, monitoring, and oversight. Very important. So, what does it mean for you? Well, over the next 2 years, every federal department and their suppliers, as they're often called federal contractors, must develop an inclusion action plan, post it, and update it, all the while ensuring that they have engaged persons with disabilities in the process. And that's why Reachability is so pleased to have been doing this work already for over 20 years, because we're ready to show you how easy it is to not only be compliant, but to grow your business. A true win, win, win. Now, I want to introduce my special guest today, an appearance by the Deputy Minister, Yasmin Laroche. She has been tasked with implementing the ACA across Canada. And although my full-length interview with Madame Laroche is on my Tova Talks, and I believe on the Reachability Association YouTube channel, you could find the full conversation because it's pretty high level and pretty amazing stuff. And she herself is so incredible. But at this point, I wanted to just give you a couple of thoughts from Madame Laroche about the ACA. So I'm going to hand this over to my incredible producer, Kelsey, to make the smooth transition to video. Before we even take off, I need to warm up the plane and ask you the most important question. Tell us, what is the Accessible Canada Act, or as I like to call it, the ACA, and any kind of overview you could provide us from your perspective.
Sure. As you might be able to tell, I'm a bit older and I've been a public servant for a really long time, but I've been a person with a disability my whole life. And as a public servant for many years, I've seen lots of initiatives over the years, but this is the first federal effort to really take a comprehensive view around accessibility. And for me, it's a huge step forward. It's about eliminating and preventing barriers to inclusion, and it puts people at the heart of the legislation. And the legislation was really kind of amazing because it was tabled on June the 18th of 2018, and it received royal assent on June the 21st of 2019. That's 1 year for a very comprehensive piece of legislation. And a lot of people watching this might not be political junkies or political science junkies, but that is unbelievably fast for a piece of legislation to
That's
clear.
like overnight in real world terms.
It
We're
is.
talking a pretty big government machine. So I totally get that. Thank you.
Yeah. And I was so thrilled that I actually got to attend the ceremony, which took place in the Senate of Canada, where the legislation received royal assent. And what's really cool about this process, for those of you who haven't participated, when the Governor General is there, and royal assent literally means she does this. Somebody presents her with a physical copy of the bill, and she goes, when she's asked if it is her pleasure to pass the legislation.
God
That is
forbid
literally
she
royal
sneeze,
assent.
Yasmin. God
Or
forbid
what?
she sneeze.
Or like, but what? Like, I wonder sometimes, like, what if she does this sometimes? Then what do you do?
Throw everyone into a tizzy.
Exactly. But so that's the actual coming into effect, or the royal assent. But specifically, the act. What's so interesting about it is that it actually gives the government of Canada the authority to create new accessibility standards and regulations that apply to all of the sectors under federal jurisdiction. So that means companies in banking, broadcasting, telecommunications, transportation industries like air and rail, and of course the government of Canada itself. Because as we know, and we're learning this right now through COVID, we are a federal system. And different parts of that system have different areas of jurisdiction. So this legislation applies to those areas where the federal government has jurisdiction. And what it does is it will require organizations in those areas of federal jurisdiction to identify, to remove, and to prevent barriers to accessibility in 7 key areas. So the first is the built environment. That means buildings and public spaces. The second is employment. The third is information and communication technology. It's like what we're using right now to do this interview. The fourth one, and this is really interesting, it's the broader definition of communications. And we've really seen through COVID-19 the criticality of clear communications, also the importance of ALS and LSQ, sign language, especially when we're trying to communicate information during a crisis. The fifth element is procurement, which is essentially how we buy things and making sure that the things that we buy have accessibility baked into them. The sixth is the design and delivery of programs and services, because most of those areas under federal jurisdiction are in the business of providing programs and services to Canadians. So you want to make sure that they're going to be accessible. And finally, transportation. And so that's kind of a brief overview of the legislation. And I am very excited by it because it's comprehensive. And I am so excited to see what progress we're going to be making as a result. So thanks for the question.
No, I'm really, I heard 3 key things right at the beginning, but and that was to ID, to prevent, and to remove. And I guess as a macro kind of approach to that, what we're looking at is taking the stigma and IDing where it is, in a sense, preventing it from occurring and removing it so that we can equalize the playing field one ability at a time, as I like to say. So we're really grateful for that opportunity, and the clarity of that message, I think, is really there. So thank you for that. So let me ask you this. I mean, it may sound a little obvious, but for people with disabilities who maybe aren't necessarily, like you said, political junkies or into the legislation, and they've heard you overview 7 things and they're like, wow, it sounds good. But what does it mean for those folks just at home right now, living with disabilities, facing some of these, challenges that we all know, you yourself as a person who self-identifies, and I myself as well. And I wanted to ask you clearly, what should they know? What should it mean for them on a maybe a more micro level?
Well, I'm going to start actually at a bit of a macro level and then go down to micro. Because I think what I mentioned in the first question, at the heart of this piece of legislation is the principle of nothing without us. So people with disabilities are at the heart of the legislation. It's not something that's being done to people with disabilities or for people with disabilities. The Act requires every organization that's going to be governed by the Act to develop something called a multi-year accessibility plan. So back to those 3 points about barriers. And so they're going to have to say, what are we doing to identify, remove, and prevent barriers in these 7 areas? Well, that sounds great. That's wonderful. But the legislation doesn't stop there. It doesn't just tell organizations this is what you have to do. The legislation says, and you also have to report on how you engaged and involved people with disabilities in developing these plans. And what's the feedback mechanism that you've developed so that people can give you regular feedback in terms of how you're going to do this? And for me, that's a game changer because, again, it puts people with disabilities at the heart. We are being asked to contribute to these plans. The second is those regulations that I mentioned. So one of the things that the Act did, it created a new body called Accessible Standards Canada. And that organization is going to actually create the standards and regulations in most of the 7 areas covered by the legislation. So for the first time, there will be clear federal standards in key areas that matter to those of us Canadians with disabilities. And the agency was one of the first things that was set up once the legislation was put into effect. And I can tell you, I've met with them and they are amazing. They're kind of like you, Tova, really committed, passionate, dedicated. And the interesting thing is, by legislation, this organization is required to be very representative of people with disabilities. So their board, their senior management, and their technical advisory committees. It's not just going to be groups of, technical experts, but their advisory committees will also include people with lived experience and expertise. So it means that we get to influence and bring our own expertise and experience into this, which I find really exciting. So what differences are we likely to see? Well, over time, we should expect to see better use of technology to support the delivery of services for Canadians with disabilities. We should expect to expect better services from the Government of Canada in terms of access to our services, to our spaces. I've seen some of the work that's already underway in really reimagining our physical workspace to make it as accessible as possible to all Canadians. And it should be a more welcoming experience for people with lived experience. So I hope that answers the question a little bit.
It does, and it certainly it leaves me with 20 more, but that's the nature of this information. It's so wonderful, and you want to then build from there. This information, it's so wonderful, and you want to then. Okay, it truly does go on, and if you are like me interested in what Madame Yasmin Laroche said, then I do advise you to track down the Tova Talks with Madame Yasmin Laroche, Deputy Minister. She said I could call her Yasmin. That was pretty cool. Anyway, more importantly, I think her message is clear on the ACA and the power the ACA has in terms of how it's going to change our lives. So in the tourism industry in particular, I'm asking the question, what does the ACA mean for you? The community thinks inclusion is important. Frankly, the ACA says that, because it wouldn't have gotten through in the speed if there wasn't a sense of wanting behind it. The legislation is clearly reflecting the desire of the community around inclusion of persons with disabilities. So as a result, there are actually a lot of opportunities that now exist to go beyond today's overview and to work with agencies or Reachability's Accessible Tourist Program, for example, to achieve a win-win-win result. I mentioned the accessible tourist because a number of years ago, now it's just over 2 years ago, we felt the importance of the inclusion of persons with disabilities in the tourism industry, and we began the process of building what the tourist was and what it means. And that was very important to our process. And what we discovered was we wanted to create that accessible host. That the tourist was one piece of it, ensuring that people with disabilities have true information on where to go, where they'll be welcomed and truly accommodated. But without working on the other side, the accessible host side, it just didn't make a lot of sense. And especially where Reachability's expertise lay in training and education around inclusion of diverse populations, it made sense that we talked about the compliance solution, especially to our accessible hosts. The accessible host, first of all, are the industry. Whether owners who wish to make an effort to meet the needs of various communities that require accommodation, whether it's a manager trying to be inclusive, Honestly, everyone in the industry is welcome to become an accessible host. Our goal is to provide hosts with the tools to not only become ACA compliant, but truly the best in the business. I'm not sure anything less would do. This is just a quick overview of some of the information around the accessible tourist. As a person with ADHD, I'm not sure it's a great visual, but I do love all the information, including the fact that 50 billion is the annual buying power of persons with disabilities in Canada. Or did you know, for instance, that the accessibility services of this little NGO in Nova Scotia include nationwide training and awards for it? And we also wanted to share with you the 5 easy steps to inclusion or to become an accessible host. So that's kind of where this all came from. We put in stats, all kind of stuff. But let's really talk about the 5 steps, because our team of experts have developed a 5-step process that describes the road to compliance, utilizing both provincial and federal legislation, so you don't have to worry about where they fit or don't. The inclusion works, the steps of the program for accessible hosts really are 5 in nature. The first, goals-oriented consultation, The second, customized multi-level proprietary survey. The third step, results delivery. The 4th, action plan. And of course, the 5th is the implementation of the plan. Let me break down a little bit what I mean by goals-oriented consultation. No matter what is going on, what's your industry, Reachability works with P3 businesses all the time and have for over 20 years. Whether you are private, public, or nonprofit, the first thing we do is discuss your needs. We don't tell you, you tell us, and we then share with you the very best toolkit out there to meet your needs. Engagement of key stakeholders means just that. Your team, your people, our team, our experts, and making sure we provide the very best and very most real time, especially in these times, information possible. And the goals-oriented consultation is to identify just that, those critical goals and tipping points that are going to make your inclusion plan truly successful, a win-win-win. Second, we talked about customized multi-level proprietary survey. Sounds fancy. Well, in a way, it kind of is, because we've partnered up with an agency called Work Tango in Ontario, and they have cutting-edge evaluation matrix. They do incredibly robust reporting. They have a completely anonymous process where you can even be talking to someone and not know who you're talking to and getting input on disability. And most importantly, unlimited revisit capacity. We can change the plan, go back in and see how we're doing. That's really important, because when you're talking about results delivery, you've got to make sure that you have available that strategic report, those clear recommendations and next steps that you're taking as part of the implementation and development of that action plan. Implementation, well, we're really talking about activities and timeline. We're talking about award-winning customized training. We're talking about ACA and Accessibility Directorate, or if you're in Ontario or Manitoba, let us know. We understand those acts as well, and we understand the importance of being compliant in our activities of all of them. Employment HR services, Reachability's already been there. In fact, I'm so proud to say that during this very difficult time, those that chose to want to continue their search for employment have been reaching out to us and indeed finding employment. We are averaging the same amount of employment that we did before the outbreak and the limits that were put on us. So I give the team at Reachability and those experts a lot of credit for maintaining all of our employment and services and self-management services online. And that's something that we've been very good at, and we want to share it with you too. The ability to take your employment and HR services and make sure they are everything they should be to be compliant. And of course, a timeline. Very important. Some stakeholders can't move at the same pace as others. It could be size. It could be a number of issues. It could be their own agendas and their annual plans. We work with you on developing an activity and timeline report that will allow you to understand all the steps you need to take now. So I wanted to give you the smallest of tastes because I realize we don't have a lot of time. And I wanted to sort of show you that some of the things we're really focused on is helping you build your inclusion toolkit. At the end of the accessible host sessions, we believe that that is the place we want to send our accessible tourists because we've provided you information on growing your talent pool, expanding your client base, and all the while remaining compliant. Truly a win, win, win. I wanted you to know, I mentioned some of it earlier, but were you really aware that in terms of workplace accommodations for employees in Canada, that 1 in 3 employees usually require at least one workplace accommodation? That's 37%. That's incredible. That means this isn't new. It just means we have to wake up to doing it if we're going to be an inclusive employer, inclusive of persons with disabilities, inclusive of their accommodation needs. In fact, the most commonly required type of workplace accommodations are flexible work arrangements. Hold off on the other ones for a minute. Flexible work arrangements. How much has your perception changed of what flexible work arrangements look like? I'm going to be very frank with all of you. I never thought the work that we've been doing from home through Zoom and Big Marker and all these other Facebook and, oh my God, I don't know, YouTube, you name it. The work that we've been doing on the phone, through snail mail, you name it, that we could do what we've done. So as always, what Reachability has proved to me, it is the people, not the program. And the team at Reachability has shown an incredible resilience, and any inclusive employer must follow that lead and also show resilience. So of those who required accommodation, I simply wanted you to know that Canadians are doing a pretty good job. I mean, almost 60% of accommodation requirements were met. But that really means 40% didn't have them met. And in fact, half of that didn't have them met at all. So let me just remind you very quickly, no matter what you do for an accommodation, whether it is due to a newcomer, a disability, whatever kind of inclusion you're trying to enforce, I ask you to check back in. I always have a saying, revisit, reassess, revise. You never, ever settle on the first accommodation unless you check in and make sure it really worked. It takes me a long time to make sure I give people what they need because we're all figuring it out often together. Although I do have an expectation that if you are in the workforce and live with a disability and it will affect your work, that you've already put some consideration into what accommodation you need. So do keep that in mind. We all have a responsibility. I wanted to share with you some of the really most common types of accommodation. Well, I mentioned flexibility, something I had never considered to the level I do today, knowing that I can show flexibility because my team has shown me how much work can be done remotely. So we also talk about whether it's a chair, an ergonomic setup, again, the computer, laptop, tablet, human support, adapted or accessible parking, just having a place where you can actually find a spot and get to your office, technical aids, the accessible elevator. Then we think about people, just because you have a physical disability does not mean you're using a wheelchair necessarily. So you want to look at handrails, ramps, doors, halls, and how about communication? There's so many ways we communicate now. How do we try to include everybody? Adapted washrooms, of course, specialized transportation, and any other equipment or help that might really make a difference. I always remember my old friend, Jerry. Jerry was a great guy, is a great guy. I shouldn't say it that way. Jerry's a great guy. He has one arm. He was born that way. He doesn't miss it. He never had it. For Jerry, it's just a question of getting a job where people automatically go, oh, you're missing your arm. You can't do that. And it would really drive him crazy because really all he wanted to do was maybe work on a nice assembly line, low impact, nothing that challenged too much around his mental health issues. He was a great guy as an employee. And he was quite a number of years with his previous employer until they basically shut down. Well, he came to me 8 years later and said, you were great the last time. How can you help? And I reached out and I discovered somebody who has one of those candle making places with the soya candle in the mason jar. And I thought, that's a great little assembly line work. And he said to me, yeah, I need somebody. And I went, if I could find you someone you're interested in. He went, absolutely. So of course I told him about Jerry. And he said, whoa, 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 whoa. It takes 2 hands, Tova, to do this job. And I'm going to show you, if I'm allowed to do this, I hope I am because I'm breaking the rules. I said, I can show you how you can use this jar with this lid and Jerry can do it. So let me show you what we did. First of all, I should show you the job. The job was to take the mason jar with the candle in it and put the lid on and then put it in the box. So you can see what my friend saw, how 2 hands were necessary. So what we did was say, look, we've been here before. Jerry and I knew the drill. I had my husband create a winch. A winch is like a piece of wood that fit perfectly the mason jar. So what Jerry could do is take the bottle, put it in the winch, put the lid on, take it out of the winch, and put it in the box. He's still there today. And that's what I'm talking about. So let me go back to the slides because that was my visual for the moment, but not. Try one more time. There we go. So we were talking about accommodation, and I think I'm trying to talk about Jerry because it's so important to understand ease of accommodation. Look, if you are or choose to be an accessible host, then you already know something. You know the importance of equalizing the playing field in your workplace. As an accessible host, you would know that inclusion of persons with disabilities is going to make good business sense. We've certainly talked about that a little bit. You also would know that travelers with disabilities, they often like to travel in the off season or what you guys call the shoulder season. And that's important to recognize because that's one of the seasons you really want to pick up business. Why? Because it's probably more accommodating, fewer people. It's not that surprising. I'll tell you another little surprise. According to Parks Canada, persons with disabilities, #1 preference in travel in Canada is parks. So if you don't think we like camping, you're wrong. Remember, travelers with disabilities just are asking for the playing field to be equalized. Nothing special about accommodating us. So I wondered today, just a couple of tips for you to take along. Have you ever considered allowing a section for service animals, just in case someone does come in with an allergy and you have a concern around that? I have a dish for water in my office. So when someone comes in with a service animal, I don't interrupt the animal. I simply say, welcome, have a seat, whoever it is, Kathy. Can I offer you a glass of water? And can I offer your service animal a water? And when they say yes, I bring out my little dog dish and I put it down there and I leave the animal alone because he's working but thirsty. Just keep that in mind. How about having some straws available? Believe me, the landfills won't fill on the ones that are requested. And there's other things we should be thinking about if we're serious about talking about greening up. But that's another module. And how about accessible washrooms? Just clearly marked exit points, gender neutral signage, just a little, hey, we're all in it together. Even small flashlights. I was in the restaurant business for years, catering, restaurant, front and back, you name it. Been there, done that. And just those little cheap flashlights for reading, boy, did the tip go up among those wonderful baby boomers like me. So keep that in mind. You want to help people navigate dimly lit spaces. Not everyone is blind who is visually impaired. Low noise designated spaces. Let me be clear. We're not just talking about, for instance, at a hotel where the check-in is chaotic between, of course, the check-in time of 4 and 5, but perhaps an accommodation of a check-in at a different time for a family with a child with autism or someone super sensitive to noises and a little more chaos, or even someone who lives with a mental illness and can clearly tell you that crowds are a real trigger. These are some of the things you can do without any real cost or difficult effort. It truly comes down to education and osmosis. What do I mean by osmosis? Meaning the more people that are in your culture living with disability who are comfortable talking about it and sharing it, whether visual or not, whether one you can see or not. Those people are your source and they're there now. So by letting them speak to truth, I think you're opening up your doors. The more people you know who use a wheelchair, the less worried you are about having a person who uses a wheelchair. The more Jerrys you know, the more quickly you're going to think this could be done with one arm. Please keep that in mind as we talk. So menus with large print. Again, not everybody is blind who is visually impaired. And I have to tell you, as somebody over 50, okay, well over 50, I can really, truly tell you that large print would be a gift right along with that flashlight probably. And e-reading software works for some folks. You know, you're a little ahead of me. I always advise for anyone who asks me to have a lower counter height, at least in one section of your space where there's a counter, because those that use assistive devices, whether walkers, wheelchairs, will require to sit down or be at that height. You don't want to make them stand if they're using a walker either. So keeping in mind having a lower counter height lets them know they're welcome. We're all welcome. Well-lit pathways. This is for everyone. Now I'm talking universal design. That quiet area that I mentioned earlier, those low sensory times that I wish to encourage. But let me be very clear. Number one is be honest. I was in the industry and we used to dance as fast as we can. But I've really learned as I got older, and of course from the perspective of a person with disabilities, that it's really important not to tell people fake promises, whether that means is the table ready in 5 minutes or I'll get you in 1 and then it's 30. That really creates agitation for everyone. But for someone living with a challenge, whether cognitive or physical, it doesn't really matter because that time matters. They might have gone back to their car and waited in the car, but you didn't give them the truth, so they didn't get the option. Where possible, encourage your entire team from the front to the back of house to be honest. Look, this is the year of the staycation, right, Canada? And we must work together to make this country the most inclusive and welcoming country in the world. How cute is he? Okay, so everybody loves action. I know I do. So I wanted to give you some actions right now you can take on. Whether that's literally looking at when you hire people, ensuring that persons with disabilities are part of your recruitment goals. And again, if you don't know how, you've got people like the Accessible Tourist now to reach out to. You might want to include a section about diversity and inclusion in your company's training for all employees. You may have your management staff participate in one of our sessions of training through Reachability's Accessible Tourist program. You may also have your physical space on an online material all assessed for both their accessibility and what I like to call their welcomeability. You know, I like that ability stuff. You may also want to apply for one of the grants if you're in Nova Scotia, or look for alternate grants across Canada, because there's a lot out there to help cover costs of improvements and renovations as they relate, especially to the standards we discussed in detail earlier. I hope at this point we can all take a deep breath. I know I will. And reflect for a moment on what, if any, perspective this brief time we've had together provided you on the issue of inclusion of persons with disabilities in the hospitality industry and certainly well beyond. I ask you to reflect at this time, and don't be afraid with a pen and paper to write it down. What was your single most important takeaway from today's discussion? I urge you to consider that and then move that one thing that you will definitely do differently after watching this module today. And I'd love to hear from you, whether right now or perhaps through email at Tova, Tova, at reachability.org. I'll provide you that. But more importantly, I hope that you'll consider the importance of accessibility and the Accessible Tourist Program for hosts across Canada, and certainly with a focus on the importance of building, sustaining, and developing and re-emerging the tourism industry here in Nova Scotia, our home province. It is National Accessibility Week, and it has never been more important to consider the one thing you're going to do to be more inclusive in your industry, whatever it may be. I am inspired by the whole idea of the accessible tourist, of a country where people feel so welcome that they just can't believe it. They just keep booking and coming back. That's what we want, isn't it? So yes, I am Tova Sherman. I am the CEO of Reachability, and I'm very proud of the entire team at Reachability who've provided us all the opportunity to celebrate National Accessibility Week and share with our very hard-hit friends in the tourism industry some good news. And I truly believe it to be so. And that's our little presentation for today. So I hope again that you've had the opportunity to really think about and reflect, as I asked, on what your takeaways were today. Take a moment. And what are you going to do with that information? That's really interesting to me. So feel free, if you are watching today, or maybe later with this link that might have been shared by somebody, I'd love to hear from you directly at reachability.org. You can throw Tova in front of it or info. We all share. We're very big sharers, trust me. And on behalf of my staff of 20 people, the majority of who self-identify as living with disability, I assure you, we are stakeholders in the disability world. We're not just people working. We don't just care. We live it every day. And I think that lends truth to power in this particular presentation. And I think that's why the accessible tourist and those who choose to become accessible hosts are going to be leading the way, blazing the trail here in Canada. And I'm very proud to be part of that. Just before we had the unfortunate lockdown, I was in Newfoundland at a Parks Canada conference for Newfoundland tourism. And I spoke there on behalf of Parks Canada, I should say. And I cannot tell you the amount of passion for inclusion, whether from a personal standpoint, I live with it, or I know someone and care about someone who does, or from professional. It makes good business sense. I see that. I've seen the stats where people with disabilities stay at their jobs longer than people without, that people with disabilities are going to, have less sick days. Everyone assumes it's more. Oh no, the stats show less. It's fascinating. So I really want you to say to yourself, where's my win-win-win? And if I can't find it, I challenge you to write Tova at reachability.org, and I'll tell you the win-win-win. I'll break it out for you. And more important, the accessible tourist awaits your call to support you and your industry in becoming the most inclusive, not only in Canada, but the most inclusive place to visit anywhere. I believe we can achieve it. We're on the right road. We've just got to keep blazing that trail. We can't afford to wait for everyone else to do it. Nova Scotia needs to be a leader. And this is certainly a place where we can be and should be. So thank you for joining me today, and have a wonderful day. Bye for now.